समझ अपनी भाषा में ही आता है, कंटेंट आपकी भाषा में ओनली ऑन डेली हंट। हमें पता है आपको क्या चाहिए, अपनी पसंद का कंटेंट ओनली ऑन डेली हंट। रखो अपने एरिया की खबर, लोकल अपडेट्स ओनली ऑन डेली हंट।
Welcome back to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival here at Diggy Palace, front lawns protected by Dettol. It's our pleasure to present Speak Memory, My Years with Rajiv, Wajahat Habibullah in conversation with Pavan K. Varma. The first Chief Information Commissioner of India, Wajahat Habibullah's recent book, My Years with Rajiv, Triumph and Tragedy, offers an acute insight into his professional and personal relationship with the former Prime Minister of India. The book also gives us a ringside view of the latest 3 decades of the 20th century from the perspectives of a respected officer of the Indian Administrative Services. Habibullah is the former chairperson of the National Commission for Minorities. He's also written the book My Kashmir, The Dying of the Light. Conversation with writer and diplomat Pavan K. Varma, he attempts to demystify the workings of the Indian government and bureaucracy and gives us a candid account of some of the most formative years of Indian contemporary history. Wajahat Habibullah is a former chairperson of the National Commission for Minorities, and prior to this he was the first Chief Information Commissioner of India. He was an officer of the Indian Administrative Service of the J&K cadre from 1968 until his retirement in September 2005. Having served in India and the US, he recently released My Years with Rajiv, Triumph and Tragedy. Pavan K. Varma is a writer, diplomat and now in politics, where he was till recently a member of parliament in the Rajya Sabha and earlier an advisor to the Chief Minister of Bihar. He's an author of over a dozen best-selling books, including Ghalib, The Man, The Times, The Great Indian Middle Class, The Book of Krishna, Being Indian, Becoming Indian, and Chanakya's new Manifesto. His latest book is the greatest ode to Lord Ram, Tulsidas's Ramcharitramanas. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section below. Ladies and gentlemen, Speak Memory, My Years with Rajiv, Wajahat Habibullah, in conversation with Pavan K. Varma.
Let me reiterate what a great pleasure it is to be a part of the Jaipur Literature Festival again, and to congratulate the organizers for their sheer commitment and perseverance to this landmark event year after year. I'm delighted that we have today with us Wajahat Habibullah, who's been a remarkable bureaucrat, thinker, writer, and also, very importantly, witness personally to the unfolding of history. His family was generationally connected in a sense with some of the architects of modern Indian history, Jawaharlal Nehru, Indira Gandhi, and later Rajiv Gandhi, and he worked very closely with them. And I had forgotten, frankly, that until he mentioned to me that I had some role in the writing of this book, because he says I suggested it to him. It slips my memory. But nevertheless, the book is important because in India we do not have sufficient number of contemporary accounts of recent history. And here he records how events that we know of actually unfolded from an insider's point of view. He was working in the Prime Minister's office and was a close colleague of the late Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. So let me begin by first saying, since you knew him personally as well, I want to begin by understanding what kind of person was Rajiv Gandhi, as not the Prime Minister necessarily, but as a human being, as an individual. What do you consider to be his greatest strengths, and what, if any, were his weaknesses?
Thank you for your very kind introduction, but may I start by actually thanking Sanjay, Namita and others for inviting me to this premier book festival, not only in our country but all over the world. I'm deeply honored that you thought me fit to come and talk about my work today. This festival, as has been mentioned, is a festival of world standing. And the effort of every author, of course, is to reach out, to help people understand something that he feels holds dear and wishes to write about. And there can be no more fitting and beneficial instrument than the Jaipur Literature Festival. So, Sanjay, thank you very much for having me here. And thank you for insisting that I actually appear in person, because I had all kinds of hesitations thanks to COVID. I'm based now in Lucknow. Thanks to COVID, chakka jam, farm laws agitation, and so on. But it's a pleasure to be with all of you today and to talk about my work. Yes, Pavan, you asked about what sort of a person was Rajiv. Now, the reason why I suppose I felt so close to him and why I felt that I would like to write about him is because he was a person very much like myself. We shared a very common background. He had Awadhi forebears, as have I. He and I shared the same school. It's true, and as I mentioned in my book, we were not particularly close friends in school. His brother Sanjay was a closer friend than was he. He himself was a somewhat reserved child. But I felt because of this that I understood what he was trying to do when he was Prime Minister. He'd often talked to me about it. I discovered, in fact, when I was writing my book, that I was one of the few people who he did talk in considerable detail about, because it would normally be a very informal conversation. We were talking to each other as two old friends, not really talking to each other as a master and as a bureaucrat and a political leader. And that was on issues which I may or may not have been actually addressing and working on directly. My friend Mani has said, and he was a colleague of mine, and I mentioned him many times in the book, mentions that the Prime Minister's office under Rajiv was somewhat compartmentalized. I really didn't find it that way. I don't know why. My experience was different, because I would be discussing with him issues which did not really concern me directly while I was in what I was dealing, the subjects that I was dealing or was desk officer for in the PMO. And that is what gave me the feeling that I must write about it. Because if that is the case, and he liked to open up with me, which he probably may or may not, I of course can't speak for others, then it deserves to be put on record because of what you mentioned. It is now very much part of history. So that really, and as you mentioned, I did. You are the ones who put the idea into my head. I had been given an offer by some publishers to write this book, but when I was visiting Bhutan on the issue of promoting the RTI as adoption in Bhutan, in that country, where it has been adopted, then I happened to mention this to him and suggest, and because he's an experienced writer and author, published, I wanted his clarification on how I should go about it. And he's the one who suggested that I actually put this book together. And then after that, I worked off and on, slowly, sometimes fast, to put it together, because I felt that this was a man who needed to be remembered. I've quoted, of course, from Julius Caesar and from Hamlet in my book to describe the kind of man who Rajiv was. But I felt that it was my duty to him. As a friend, I mentioned to you that I was not a particular friend in school, but by the end of our time together, I certainly could regard myself as a friend. It was a duty of mine as a friend to him, to his family, to put it down in writing as to what he had contributed to this nation. I hope I have succeeded in doing so to a limited extent.
Thank you, Wajahat ji. Now, because the time is short, and I'm sure people will read your book to understand Rajiv Gandhi better, I want to focus on a few issues that were highlights during Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's tenure. Let me first take the Shah Bano case, where you had a Supreme Court ruling which upheld the rights of Shah Bano, and you had an entire lobby of conservative Muslims opposing it. From what you write and your note that you gave to him, it appeared that Rajiv Gandhi was initially persuaded to support the progressive ruling of the Supreme Court. He changed his mind. And what I found very interesting in your book is that so far we thought that it was quote unquote seasoned leaders of the Congress, who I will not name, who told him that you cannot for this reason lose the Muslim vote bank. But you mentioned that when you walked into Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's room, it was a journalist turned politician called M.J. Akbar, who ironically then later joined the BJP, who was convincing Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi why he should overrule that judgment through an ordinance, because he should not alienate Muslim opinion. Now, if this is true, I think this is for the first time a revelation about somebody who has been a well-known journalist and today claims to be supporting the BJP.
So far as MJ is concerned, he's always been a good friend. He became a good friend, in fact, because Rajiv relied a lot on him. And he continued after that because of his own interest in Kashmir. So our friendship lasted well after that too. But so far as the Shah Bano Amendment is concerned, yes, there was a Supreme Court ruling. It led to a bit of a hullabaloo. I happened to be the desk officer in charge of issues concerning the minorities. And as I mentioned in my book, a spew of representations appeared. And it's also true. Like among his own colleagues, people like Kivai and others were wanting to persuade him that the government intervene in order to rectify what they felt was the Supreme Court's damage done to the dispensation of the Muslim personal law. Now, I had then put up a note to him saying that the Supreme Court is the Supreme Court. You know, the somewhat abstruse opinion that was proffered to Rajiv was, by the more conservative of the clergy, that a decision pronounced on Muslim personal law by a judicial body which is not comprised of clerics is itself invalid under Muslim law. Now, that's an argument that you could carry on in judicial circles, but not one that I would necessarily subscribe to, certainly not in a country which is governed by a democratic constitution like India. So I had therefore suggested in my note to him, after discussing all these, that if you, and I don't know, it is not that Rajiv naturally said that he wanted to support the Supreme Court judgment. My recommendation to him was that this is a Supreme Court judgment which is based on rulings drawing down from the Quranic teaching, from the Sharia. It is not that they have set aside that. They have respected the Sharia and come up with this recommendation, with this ruling, that this is in keeping with Islamic law. And I cannot buy this argument that if a judge who is not a Muslim rules that it is in keeping with the Quran, therefore the decision itself is invalid. I cannot subscribe to that idea, nor is it substantiated by Muslim personal law itself. But anyway, that is another area for arguing. And therefore, we should simply, the Prime Minister should simply accept this ruling and go on with it. Here, and this, I am afraid, was a mistake made by both M.J. Akbar and myself. M.J.'s argument was that this is something, because of the outcry in consequence of the judgment, this is something that widely affects the Muslim community. The mistake that we made, both M.J. and I, was that we did not distinguish between the opinion of the clergy and the common opinion of Muslims in general, which was at variance, but at that point was not so loud. Now, you have people who express their opinions, thanks to education and whatever, and the freedoms that we all exercise, who express their opinion, even if they contradict the clergy, without necessarily contradicting becoming apostates. But in this particular case, that was not the case. The general opinion would have remained muted. Now, Arif Muhammad Khan, on the other hand, had an opinion completely different. He felt that we should subscribe to the Supreme Court judgment. And he so advised Rajiv also. And Rajiv advised him to defend the Supreme Court judgment in front of the Muslim public. He, in fact, and I've referred to this TV program between him, MJ, and I think it was Bhaskar Ghosh who conducted the program. But they were arguing about the merits of this law, with M.J. Akbar arguing in favor of the amendment and Arif Muhammad Khan arguing against the amendment. So it's not that because MJ has now become part of the BJP, but so has, Arif has also changed his political commitments. So that is not the issue here. The issue here was that these were two opinions held at that time. And Rajiv leant towards the opinion of M.J. Akbar. And this is how I met him, because I received a message that the Prime Minister wants to see you, and then I walked into his room, and this is what I discovered. M.J. still perhaps does not realize the enormous impact that his advice had on Rajiv, because subsequently when he was spoken to by somebody, some journalist, about an article that had written about this, he said, well, we happened to discuss it before the Prime Minister, but I don't think that my advice was the one that was taken so seriously. But I can vouch for the fact that it was, because even subsequently, the discussions that were held out, and the reasons why it was, I have mentioned in my book.
So it's very clear that the BJP, of course, saw the ordinance that overruled the Supreme Court as another proof of appeasement of Muslims, which has become a far bigger platform today. And that is why I said it's ironical that Mr. M.J. Akbar, who is now part of the BJP, himself advised the Prime Minister to pass the amendment overruling the Supreme Court. Anyway, these are the twists and turns of history. Now, coming to another issue, which you have been deeply involved with. You, when you qualified for the IAS, your cadre was Jammu Kashmir. And Kashmir has been in the headlines for a variety of reasons. You were very involved with it. You have been posted in Kashmir. You were the victim of a near-fatal attack by terrorists while in Kashmir. I want to ask you a pointed question. Again, because of the shortage of time, so we move from one subject to another. Why did Rajiv Gandhi concur with the 1987 elections being so transparently rigged?
Now, I never actually discussed that with Rajiv. When the elections of 1987 were held, I was still in his office, but the issues of the questions of rigging really came down gradually. You know, it was not at that time, there was no such reaction that the elections had been rigged. Gradually, ideas came and it became known. I left that office in August. Until I had come there, there were, of course, rumors of rigging of the elections. But insofar as Kashmir is concerned, I myself have served there for many years, as you mentioned. I've actually conducted many elections there. And up till the elections of 1977, when I was actually Deputy Commissioner of Srinagar, and therefore was directly responsible for those elections, each and every election, even elements of the 1977 election, were actually rigged.
No, but the
Were
87
actually rigged.
election made terrorists out of
But
those who were part of the
that's right,
democratic
that's
process.
right. Exactly. That is the point. That is the point that I was wanting to make. So the rumors of the election being rigged was not something new to Kashmir. It did not necessarily indicate that these were rigged, because every election, including the 77 election, which are generally talked of as having been the first free and fair elections, but even there I would vouch for the fact that they were not entirely so. There was always this kind of touch and go. And it's not that the government was rigging the elections. It would be that, I mean, the way of doing it was so widespread and so deeply entrenched that it would be useless for me to start going into this now. And I've dealt with it, in fact, in detail in my work on Kashmir, which is called My Kashmir. So I was only explaining the fact that why notice was not taken at that time. But there has been research done, particularly on one election, and that was the election of Amira Kadal, which was a very high-profile election, because Farooq's own uncle was standing from that constituency, and the person who was opposing him is a chap who went on to become the head of Hezbollah. Now, a lot of young people who were aspiring politicians, inspired by the fact that since 77 elections had been more open, that is in 1983 there had been an open election in which the Congress had suffered a resounding defeat. But all these elections had taken place, so young people had come out. They felt that they should participate in the electoral process. They felt that freedom was now at their hands, a democratic freedom. After the accord between Sheikh Abdullah and Mrs. Gandhi, suddenly, by taking recourse to those measures again. Now, I can't say, because I have discussed the issue with Farooq, and I've quoted Farooq extensively on his reaction to this accusation that the election was rigged. You know that he said that it's all nonsense. I can't agree that the allegations of rigging in the 1987 elections were nonsense, because it's been well researched and well established. And I went back to Kashmir after 1987 and I saw clear evidence that certainly in at least 10 constituencies there was fiddling with the election. But whether they're outright rigged or not is another question. But yes, the basic issue that they were allowed to be rigged obviously had repercussions, and shortly thereafter, now, I would not say again that because of that the insurgency broke out, because when the insurgency broke out, I was very much there. But certainly, it was a contributing factor. Now, this is an issue that will be debated and will be argued.
Yeah, the only reason I think this is an important turning point in the evolution of Kashmir is that after the rigged elections of 87, there was a great fillip to insurgency. And the reason for it is that the Indian state is an all-assimilative boa constrictor. For those who were slightly more militant than the National Conference, if they had come to power, they would have got a government bungalow, 3 telephones, a car with a red light, quotas for gas connections, admission to universities. They get assimilated into the democratic and exaggerated paraphernalia of a democratic state. But if you exclude them by unfair means, they become terrorists. In fact, one of them became the head of Hizbul Mujahideen, I think, after this. So I think that was a mistake. But nevertheless, perhaps, as you said, there were perceptions of rigging. One minor question for which I'll need a brief reply, because I want to cover more subject. After Rajiv Gandhi, when there was the exodus of Hindus from the valley, you as an observer so closely involved with Kashmir, what was your reaction?
That was a major tragedy. I was not only an observer, I was in fact in Kashmir. I was Special Commissioner Anantnag. It was the government of Mr. Mr. Jagmohan, who was governor at that time, and it was under central rule that this exodus actually began. It started in about January of 1990. I arrived in Kashmir in February of 1990, but the exodus in January had been from Srinagar. After the Gaukadal firing and all that, the details are all there. But I arrived in February and was appointed as Special Commissioner of Anantnag because the state had broken out into insurgency. There were special commissioners appointed in 3 divisions in Kashmir, whereas earlier there had been 1 commissioner. And I was appointed in Anantnag. I couldn't function. The administration had broken down altogether, completely. But there were still people, Kashmiri Pandits, who were working there, who were in the government there. There were villages, and Matan is an important center, hub of Kashmiri Pandits because the holy shrine of Matan.
Keep your mic closer.
There's a holy shrine there. And so the Kashmiri Pandits were still very much there in Anantnag. But that is where the breakdown took place, and I saw what was happening. I can vouch for the fact. Now, details you'll have to get from my back because it'll take me too long to cover it here, and you want me to be brief. But what I can say is it was a complete failure of the government, of which I was very much part. It was our failure. And therefore, there are, of course, allegations made against Mr. Jagmohan that he actually promoted the exodus. That is not so. But it is so badly mishandled by his government and by himself that the exodus happened. And we have not been able to rectify that, despite efforts, even in that time, by various ministers in that government and afterwards to try and rectify the situation. It has not been rectified for reasons which I can easily understand, and which I have really no time to discuss because it is an elaborate and a diverse subject which will take a rather long time to discuss.
Another important aspect of Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's years was our operation in Sri Lanka, the sending of the IPKF. And certainly I was myself as an officer in the Ministry of External Affairs. I visited with a group of media people. The IPKF flew with General Kalkat in a helicopter in the Tamil-dominated areas. There was a very successful operation when there was a coup in the Maldives, again for which I had gone as part of the Indian presence there following our intervention. But I want to ask you a question. Did Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, although well-intentioned, did he overtrust Prabhakaran, who by many accounts was an incorrigible terrorist and a psychopath? And he had advice from people not to trust him, including his own colleagues. And we know the fatal results of that trust as well. Did he overtrust him?
Indeed. And I have said in my book that what was his greatest strength, in my view, as a human being, Rajiv's greatest strength was his exceedingly trusting personality. But as I've also mentioned, this was also his greatest failing. And why I consider it his greatest failing is exactly the reason that you have mentioned. He put his trust on Prabhakaran. Now, the question is that people around Prabhakaran were advising, and Ronan Sen was, of course, at that time, from your service, he was advising Rajiv. He will attest to this fact. He was advising against it. Then Mr. Narasimha Rao, who was his Minister for External Affairs, and as you know, he was a person who had a reputation for being suspicious of everybody. But he had warned against Prabhakaran, and I've in fact quoted in my book of Rajiv's reaction to what Prabhakaran had said. He had used the very words for Prabhakaran which he used for me after I was nearly killed in a terrorist attack. That be careful. He told these words to Prabhakaran. But The actual failing there in Sri Lanka was this, that Rajiv was very keen to look out for the Tamil community who he felt were being oppressed, were being unjustifiably suppressed. But he was not willing to sacrifice the unity of Sri Lanka. For practical reasons also, that would have set a very bad precedent for our country, which had separatist movements. He could not afford to encourage that, even politically. But he was also very sincere in wanting to preserve the integrity of Sri Lanka by holding India out as an example. How with far greater diversities in our country, we were able to hold together, not only hold together, become stronger together. So that was the way out for Sri Lanka, is what he wanted to say. But he made it clear. And as I said, he was very trusting. He openly spoke out when perhaps it would have been more subtle not to speak out. And on the eve of his assassination, in fact, when he was asked that if you come back, what will you do? He said that I will see that Sri Lanka remains united. He actually said that in an open press conference.
There was one other incident which created a fair deal of controversy at that time, and that was the banning of Salman Rushdie's book during his tenure. And again, it was seen as the administration, the government, and the Prime Minister himself bowing down to this conservative Muslim lobby, because, of course, now the banning of books and has become far more common. Films are banned, television serials are banned, books are banned, art exhibitions are closed down, etc. But it's important to remember that at that time, a decision of this nature perhaps set a precedent. And once again, it's good to know from the point of view of history, what were Mr. Rajiv Gandhi's personal inclinations in the matter?
Well, he hadn't read the satanic verses. What came to his attention, really, how this really came to his attention, there was, of course, the furor, the usual furor. But what brought this to his attention was the reporting by Madhu Jain on her interview with Salman Rushdie and then what she had written about it. And Madhu, of course, says that the headlines given to the interview and the publication of that, but I think India Today, I've quoted that, of course, were different to what she'd actually discussed in the interview. But she said that is the privilege of the editor. They do that to sensationalize the article. But on the basis of that, Salman Rushdie, I believe that he told Madhu this, is because of those headlines that it was abandoned. That is not the reason. The reason was, and in fact Mr. Khushwant Singh later denied that I was in no way responsible. I did not recommend the banning. That's also true. But again, as in the case of Akbar, Sardar Khushwant Singh was a person who was highly respected by Rajiv. And what Khushwant Singh ji had said is that I know my Muslim friends. If this book is published in India, there won't be anything of Penguin left or something of that nature.
He was a consultant with Penguin at that time.
Yes, that's right. He was a consultant with Penguin. So he had advised Penguin not to. But he also made this statement. Now, when that came to the notice of Rajiv, and again, by then, I was no longer, so I can't claim to have advised Rajiv, unlike in Shahbano, I can't claim to have advised Rajiv that don't do it or whatever. I only had occasion to discuss it with him afterwards. But then, in discussing it with him, I'm afraid I really didn't discuss it very seriously, because then Salman had written back to him. Now, it was banned, it was not banned, the publication of that book was not banned in India. What was banned was its import. It was not allowed to be imported into India. So if somebody, and in fact, David had probably wanted to...
Davidar.
Yeah, he wanted to publish it in India, and he was advised against it by Khushwant Singh to go for the publication of it. in India. But it could have been done. The book had not been banned from that point of view. But yes, I must admit that, the letter that Salman wrote to the Prime Minister at that time was one which I jokingly, of course, said to Rajiv, to Rajiv Gandhi, that, well, if he doesn't deserve the book to be banned on its merits, he deserved the book to be banned on the letter that he's written. But anyway, that was just a joke. The question of the precedent which it set, yes, that was an unfortunate precedent. I don't know what I would have advised had I been with the Prime Minister at that time, in the Prime Minister's office, but certainly I don't think that he was one who was very enthusiastic about the idea of banning books, and he would probably not have agreed to it had he been advised otherwise.
One last question, Mr. Habibullah. Rajiv Gandhi came as a knight in shining armor on a white steed, young, handsome, with a majority which has not been equaled by any leader or political party since then, 404 seats. No opposition worth the name. Who did also a great deal of good work, bringing India towards modernization, passing landmark bills like the anti-defection law. A thorough gentleman personally. I had the privilege of traveling with him at least on a dozen trips abroad. And he was without doubt a fine human being and a thorough gentleman. Now, a person who had such a mesmerizing and unchallenged position when he came to power, from someone who knows him so well and was also witness to that period, why did everything dissemble in the scope of 5 years? What happened?
There are many things, many things are said. People talk about Bofors and other things. What I've tried to outline in my book, and what I also firmly believe is, again, what I had said to you earlier, his trusting personality. He would speak, and he would speak openly. I think this was a characteristic that has not been replicated since. He would invite ideas. He would invite arguments.
Was the trust based on inexperience?
Possibly, but I think it is a good human quality. In his case, was it based on inexperience? I consider myself, I have of course a great deal of human experience, but I consider myself to be trusting. I would still, even knowing that my trust will be betrayed, I would still prefer to trust those whom I have trusted in the past. I would not like to believe that my trust is going to be betrayed. If it is afterwards betrayed, I will bear the consequences. I think that he was that sort of person. That's why I said that he was very much like myself. He continued to be very open. Even things he should not have said to somebody, he would say. For example, in the Bofors case, he went out and said, no, there can be no middlemen. But there were middlemen, because every company appoints middlemen to promote their product in any other country which is making such a huge purchase. It's another question that those middlemen were not appointed by him and his family. But the argument didn't go in that direction. It didn't go in that direction because by then there was a chorus criticism that had developed of him. Now again, the question, I believe, that why did things go wrong? Things went wrong, and I've argued that in my case, and the statistics would also show it. He lost that election in the more educated, cultivated, sophisticated of the states who would be sensitive to things like Bofors, which would be states like Karnataka, Maharashtra, Kerala. The Congress won easily. Where did it receive a body blow? It received that body blow in UP. It received that bloody blow in Bihar. What was the reason for that? It's quite clear what the reason was for that. That is because the great support base that he had in his Muslim constituency shifted. And why did it shift? Because of Babri Masjid.
Well, you know, he did open the locks of the mandir, and one thing led to another. Because he overruled the Shah Bano case, Hindu opinion was annoyed, and then to appease Hindu opinion, he opened the locks at Ayodhya, and that led to its own repercussions. These were important
Pavan,
incidents
yes,
as we see them from today's perspective.
that is true. But did he? Did he open the locks of Ayodhya so as to appease the Hindus who were annoyed with Shah Bano? I wrote out, and I know this for a fact, he was not responsible for the opening of those locks because he told me
But
so.
they couldn't have happened without his knowledge, even
No.
though Veerbhadra Singh was the chief minister.
No. It happened without his knowledge because that is what he told me. And the person who attests to this, when those locks were actually opened, my friend Mani was with him on a tour. And he said, what is this? Now, the fact that this option had probably been discussed in the party circles earlier is quite possible. It was not discussed in official circles because, as I said, I was dealing with minority affairs at that time, and it would certainly have come to me had it been discussed in the official circles. So it had not been discussed in the official circles. It's quite possible it was discussed in the party circles. And I've been told also by many people that I had spoken to so-and-so who knew Mr. Rajiv Gandhi very well. Now, other than that, that's not the case. I was speaking to Veerbhadra Singh's son the other day. He said that Arun Nehru was there with Veerbhadra Singh, sitting in his office when the locks were actually being opened. So I have also discussed there how it could have been done behind his back. Yes, you can say that the Prime Minister, not knowing what was happening, this is the question that I had asked him. I said, but you were the Prime Minister. So he said, yes, I was, and I take full responsibility. He took full responsibility. He never during his life said that, well, it happened although I had not ordered it. He never said that. You see, this is the kind of man that he was. So this is the point that I wanted to make, and therefore, saying that he opened the locks, and this is a reaction to that, therefore, he lost his support base in UP, that is not correct. But his losing his support base was a consequence of that. But his having actually seen that the locks were opened is not true.
Well, you know, it's a fascinating period of our history. We can continue to discuss it. But the time is short, but I hope we've raised enough issues to excite your curiosity to read the entire book. History is not a kind judge, usually. And equally with time and distance, many of the angularities of a particular period are overlooked, and you are sometimes generous in judging people. I think Rajiv Gandhi will always be remembered as a good human being, well-intentioned, a gentleman who did his best for his country but suffered, as you said, from being too trusting, from being over-reliant on a coterie of often ill-advised people. That excludes you, Wajahat. and sometimes suffering from lack of experience, but nevertheless he will be remembered as a colossus in the making of modern India. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pavan.
Thank you, Wajahat Habibullah and Pavan K. Varma. That was an absolutely brilliant session, and truly what you've been able to do in the book is bring us the nuance, bring us both sides of the debate on some of the key historic events of the time. Thank you all to our celebration partners, Diageo, and thank you for watching and being such a great audience. Please do remember to stay logged on, and of course, do watch sessions on Darbar Hall as well, and visit our bookstore and Earth Fables to buy any kind of craft that you may so wish to. Do remember to support us by pressing the contribute button. Every dollar or rupee will go a long way in keeping us together, body and soul, and allowing us to continue to spread knowledge and ideas and pushing back on hatred. Please tweet using the hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021, and our handles are Jaipur Litfest. Festival is protected by Dettol, so stay safe, Stay protected.